While Americans were locked in debate over protests, court rulings, and federal agents operating on city streets, something far more structural was unfolding quietly beyond the headlines. Not through a dramatic announcement, not through a declaration of war, but through pressure applied in places most voters rarely think about: trade, defense commitments, and the fragile assumptions that have defined North America for decades. By the time the public conversation caught up, the strategy was already in motion, and the consequences may outlast every controversy that distracted us from it. For weeks, the national conversation remained intensely domestic. Minnesota dominated the headlines: federal enforcement actions, court challenges, public outrage, political theater on all sides. These stories mattered. They deserved attention. But they also did something else. They consumed oxygen. While cameras, commentators, and social media focused inward, the Trump administration was operating outward, toward America's borders, its alliances, and its long-standing assumptions about power. This wasn't a sudden pivot. It was the continuation of a worldview that Donald Trump has held for decades. A worldview that sees alliances not as permanent partnerships, but as leverage arrangements. And in that worldview, no relationship is more important or more taken for granted than the one between the United States and Canada. For most Americans, Canada exists as a friendly constant, a stable neighbor, a reliable trading partner, a country that rarely complicates U.S. strategy. That assumption is precisely what changed, quietly at first. In early 2025, the administration imposed a 25% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods. There was no national address, no extended media tour. Coverage lasted less than a day. By mid-year, those tariffs were raised again, 30%, then 35%. Each escalation was framed as technical, temporary, negotiable, but together they sent a message that Ottawa understood clearly. The old baseline was gone. Then came the moment that forced the issue into the open. In January 2026, Canada's Prime Minister traveled to Beijing and signed a limited trade agreement with China. The deal itself was modest: lower tariffs on electric vehicles, expanded access for Canadian agricultural exports, supply chain coordination in critical minerals. On paper, this was normal diplomacy, but context matters. The agreement came at a moment when Washington was aggressively attempting to isolate China economically, and it came from America's closest ally. Trump's initial response was restrained. He publicly praised Canada's independence, downplayed the agreement, reassured markets. But the real response came weeks later, in a place where global power dynamics are rarely subtle. The World Economic Forum in Davos. Standing before an international audience, Canada's Prime Minister delivered a speech that avoided naming the United States directly, but left little doubt about its target. He warned that tariffs were being used as weapons, that middle powers were increasingly coerced by larger economies, that sovereignty now required resistance to pressure. In diplomatic language, this was criticism. In strategic terms, it was defiance. From Washington's perspective, the message was alarming, not because Canada was disloyal, but because Canada was signaling independence at precisely the wrong moment. The response followed quickly. Trump threatened tariffs of up to 100% on Canadian goods, not as a bargaining chip, not as an opening offer, as a deadline. To many observers, this appeared reckless. Markets reacted sharply. Editorial boards accused Trump of destabilizing the North American economy. But within the administration, the move was viewed differently. This escalation aligned directly with a document released months earlier, the Trump administration's updated national security strategy. That document outlined what officials privately call the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Its premise is blunt. No rival power, China, Russia, or otherwise, will be permitted to establish strategic influence in the Western Hemisphere, not through military bases, not through ports, and not through economic dependencies that undermine American leverage. In that framework, Canada's geography matters more than sentiment. Canada has the longest coastline in the world, direct access to the Arctic, vast underpopulated territory, and defense spending barely above 1% of GDP. From a strategic lens, that combination represents vulnerability, especially as Arctic shipping lanes open, resource competition intensifies, and China and Russia expand their northern operations. Trump's approach was to force a choice, not subtly, not politely, but decisively. That is where the now famous 51st state rhetoric enters the picture. The comment was widely mocked, dismissed as provocation, treated as political theater. But functionally, it served a different purpose. It reset the negotiating frame. By introducing the most extreme outcome imaginable, everything short of it became reasonable by comparison. Suddenly, demands that once seemed aggressive felt pragmatic. Increased Canadian defense spending, explicit alignment with U.S.-China policy, restrictions on trade agreements that bypass USMCA, expanded American access to Arctic infrastructure. Within weeks, Ottawa began moving. Canada dropped its digital services tax, announced new defense investments, cracked down on fentanyl trafficking routes, opened discussions on Arctic security cooperation at levels not seen in decades. These were not symbolic gestures, they were structural shifts. The same pattern soon appeared elsewhere. In Greenland, public outrage followed Trump's remarks. European leaders expressed disbelief. The media treated it as farce. Then negotiations quietly followed. Expanded U.S. military access, critical mineral cooperation, integration into missile defense planning. The sequence repeated: maximum pressure, maximum noise, then negotiated outcomes once the initial shock subsided. Which brings us back to Minnesota. The timing was not accidental. Domestic unrest absorbed outrage, attention, and political energy, while foreign policy maneuvers advanced with limited scrutiny. Was this cynical? Possibly. Was it effective? The evidence suggests it was. Because while Americans debated enforcement tactics, the administration was redefining North America's strategic architecture. This approach carries risks. Allies grow wary. Trust erodes. Cooperation becomes transactional. Critics argue that long-term stability requires predictability, not pressure. Trump's counter-argument is simpler. The old system depended on ambiguity, free riding, unspoken assumptions, and in his view, those assumptions no longer serve American interests. As USMCA comes up for renegotiation, this strategy is expected to intensify. Clear deadlines, hard leverage, limited patience. What replaces the old relationship will be more demanding, less sentimental, and more explicitly tied to power. Whether that represents renewal or decline depends largely on one's philosophy of leadership. But the shift itself is undeniable. While the nation argued at home, the map was being redrawn, quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that will extend far beyond the controversies that distracted us from the change.